So if you notice, the last two slides were kind of one the opposite of another one. The first one was sketching all the measures that are needed in order to foster and enable the movement of commodities and people, and in order to attract foreign direct investment, which is necessary for financing development, from the perspective of the regulatory and business environment, telecom infrastructure, more broadly market access, i.e. restriction to, say, foreign ownership of companies or property more in general, and which also included administrative border management issues. The following slide was instead the opposite. It was kind of starting from the need to speed up and to improve the efficiency of border crossing, the material act of crossing the border, and from there was painting a similar picture, again related to the need to improve market access or certainly facilitate standards that would foster the investment of foreign companies, the need for accountancy practices, the need to establish effectively the rule of law, so that transactions are secure, and so on and so forth. So in this second video, or second part of the session, we look at specifically issues related to measures that need to be taken at the border itself. Right? We kind of explored them last week, at least in part, but we're going to go a bit more in depth in this respect. So the purpose, again, is that of thinning borders, in other words, reducing divisions in the way in which the World Bank, for example, describes them. So what kind of things do we need to do in order to thin borders and indeed border crossing points? I mean, one, again, go back to last week. It's about facilitating cross-border trade. It's about providing the conditions for cross-border regional integration from the bottom up. If you clicked on the fourth video last week, with the one we didn't see live in the session, but the one that actually led to the discussion on cross-border regionalisms and border hats, you will see how the World Bank official that was speaking in that video was actually putting a lot of emphasis on the need to create and foster trade across borders in a bottom-up way. In other words, there was a recognition that a lot of trade was occurring and had occurred even before any of these concerns were taking place. And so by fostering that kind of integration at the border, it was expected, at least in the words of the World Bank official, to foster a whole series of development objectives, peace and stability and prosperity and so on and so forth. And so those formal/informal border markets, whereby what was probably previously already taking place, such as informal cross-border trade, was more formalized, has been a widespread policy dynamic across the world. I mean, this is an example of border markets in West Africa, but we also saw through the core reading last week the example of border hats taking place at the India-Bangladesh border. So go back to that discussion, to those ideas put forward by the World Bank officials, and to the discussion that ensued by looking at the core reading from last week in this respect. But there is more, again, pretty similar to what we said. So the Great Lakes Trade Facilitation project, again, sponsored by the World Bank, and the one, or certainly a component of those that the official from the World Bank in that video was talking about, it's precisely about that fostering cross-border regionalism, as it is called in this week's core reading by Faisal Karim. And what are the components of that, right? So how do you facilitate cross-border trade? Well, first, again, we insist and we go back again and again to that keyword: improve core trade infrastructure and facilities in the border areas, right? So it's about the construction of, well, demarcation, if you remember. Second, the construction of effective and efficient border posts, or indeed the creation or enabling of markets that take place. The core reading from last week was concerned with one of the crucial aspects of concern to programs like the AUBP, but also in the South Asian context, as it was expressed in last week's reading, which is gender mainstreaming. So how do you foster infrastructure in ways that is gender aware at the very least? Okay. What else is part of that? Implementation of policy and procedural reforms and capacity building to facilitate cross-border trade in goods and services. What exactly does that mean? Well, that means a whole series of things. First, it's about administrative procedures, right? Some protocols, what to do in this case or the other case. How to deal with large trucks that are covered, or how to deal with small daily traders or traders that daily go back and forth across the border to buy and sell commodities. But it's also about capacity building of border guards, and a capacity building that relates both to awareness and training on those procedures and protocols, about a broader awareness of the objectives of these programs, but also, again, about gender awareness and gender-related training. Crucially, there is a lot of component about performance-based management, right? So border posts and the management of border posts quite often follows, well, as a way of managing. I mean, there are targets being set. So X amount of seizures of drugs, right? So if you achieve, 20 tons of heroin being intercepted at the border, you are doing your job, right? In other cases, it's about preventing irregular migration and so on and so forth, right? So strengthening basic elements such as professional attitudes to border operations or customer care for officials, duty calculations for trade, and mutual respect and understanding of constraints are all part of that performance that takes place at the border. It's about sharing information. It's about, first of all, point number 2, defining clear procedures. And number 3, it's about having those procedures being fulfilled and respected by all. And it's about sharing information. So if you look at that video on the Great Lakes Trade Facilitation Program, but if you type in YouTube any kind of video on cross-border trade facilitation or border posts, you will see how those issues become very clear and very apparent, and perhaps the most important set of interventions when it comes to defining an efficient border post, one that reduces the time spent in crossing the border and manages efficiently different types of cross-border movement. And perhaps nothing reduces time more than having just one border post instead of 2. So, I mean, traditionally, take the example of this slide, you would have a border post in Uganda for anything that enters and exits Uganda, and you have a border post in Kenya to check what enters and exits Kenya, what or whom enters and exits either country. Rather, and usually you have those places in between, and I assume most of you or many of you would have had experience of those places where you cross one border, you walk a little bit, or you take a taxi or something, and you do the same again. I mean, it happens pretty much, or used to happen pretty much everywhere, whether in Europe, South America, Africa, and elsewhere, right? So the idea behind one-stop border post is to reduce that and to merge those two border posts into one. Obviously, that reduces considerably the amount of time, but it obviously requires an even more complex set of interventions. You need a harmonized system so that both border guard forces are able to take data and collect data and account for their operations in ways that are legible to ministries in either country or to whoever supervises their operations. You need a set of procedures that are agreeable to both countries that will take place in that one-stop border post. You need, again, even more capacity building, even more harmonization. You need to decide basic things such as what happens if somebody transporting an illegal commodity is caught as he or she comes from Uganda or as he and she comes from Kenya. Who takes over? I mean, many of you must have heard of the Danish series The Bridge, where a man dies exactly in the middle of the bridge connecting Sweden with Denmark. Which police force is responsible for that, right? And I mean, these kind of basic decisions are part and parcel of this. One-stop border posts are perhaps even more crucial because they, in places like Africa, they are set up explicitly as a way of reducing the time spent of crossing borders along large transport corridors. This slide, and you will find enormous examples if you're interested. I mean, the site to go for is PIDA, Project Infrastructure and Development in Africa, which, with a whole series of foreign donors and sponsors, is primarily concerned with improving infrastructure in Africa and have a series of projects specifically concerned with one-stop border posts. Have a look if you're interested, because there are great examples, project documents, budgets, and the way in which they also calculate risks, cost, the step in their implementation, and so on and so forth. So one-stop border posts kind of encapsulate at large the idea of filtering that we discussed last week, in the sense that it is through that one-stop border post that flows are sieved through and divided into legal and illegal, authorized and unauthorized, to be encouraged or to be prevented. But also represent perhaps the pinnacle of border infrastructure related investments, policy interventions, and so on and so forth. They are quite complicated to manage. You need a whole set of agreements beforehand between the governments involved, and it needs an even more difficult set of more practical and procedural agreements and protocols that establish exactly who has responsibility over what happens in a number of cases, and so on and so forth. By no means these are confined to developing countries at all. I mean, this is an example from Finland. This is an example from Finland, the Tulli customs or Tull customs, that actually is the quintessential idea of the one-stop border post. Again, please have a look and do a Google search on this, and you will find interesting videos. So, as I said, there are a series of steps involved here that go from the very broad and wide related to agreement between governments and harmonization, but there is also a very detailed mapping of the organization, the spatial organization of these places, with different routes for cargo traffic, private passengers, with x-rays, inspection halls, in some places detention cells, and so on and so forth. So these are crucial. They are, in a sense, universal, in the sense that they are implemented across the world, across the developed countries divide, if that divide has any meaning in those terms, and becomes the quintessential or the kind of aspiration for when it comes to at-the-border policies for an efficient and effective management of circulation across it. Now, what I would like you to do is to kind of step back. I mean, obviously one could explore different dimensions, and indeed partly we did explore last week when it came to gender mainstreaming, but a set of problems look back at the questions that are that we raised in last week's session. What I really want to do with the core readings this week is to actually think about those connections, which in the readings are kind of described as horizontal and vertical connections between border areas, in the case of Faisal Karim's core reading, or indeed border posts, and the wider context in which those border management interventions take place. So think about one-stop border post, for example, and how, yes, there are very specific locations, but very specific locations that are at the intersection of a wide set of social relations, social forces, markets, transport corridors, pre-existing social relations, etc., right? And the two core readings try to think about the process of integration and cross-border trade from different perspectives, mostly in relation, the Faisal Karim's reading in relation to governance issues, while the other reading, the Aniche reading, in terms of integration of the economies as such. I mean, these are both sides of the same coin. You need to rethink governance arrangements across the countries and at the border if you want to foster and facilitate legitimate trade. And with the objective of integrating the economies. So the first group exercise that I would like you to do is to take Faisal Karim's reading as a background or as a referent, as I say there, and think about context, right? I mean, I just mentioned that in Finland, at the border between Finland and Russia, the same kind of border management interventions take place. And I want you to think about the significance of context in relation to the probability of success or the challenges or the tensions that may occur when it comes to implementing border management policies aimed at fostering integration, such as border markets or one-stop border posts in different contexts. I mean, if you have read Faisal Karim's reading well, perfect, you will have a lot of answers. If you have not, well, you have your own experiences, the experiences of the country you come from, whether this is the UK in relation to Brexit, or perhaps more directly relevant to the question, Calais and Dover issues, or South Asia, or different parts of Africa, etc., etc. So take maybe 10 to 12 minutes to think about the significance of context, and take those minutes to think about, first of all, how do you paint that context. I mean, Faisal Karim has a very specific view and talks about center and periphery within the state, but you can take a broader or a different route to define that context, and think about policies such as the one that I just described in relation to context, and think about how that context may facilitate or challenge the implementation and success of those policies. If all goes well, I'll be there to check your answers and interject with you along the way at the end of the exercise. And so, to conclude this part, I wanted to take you to an article by Paul Nugent that provides a different answer than Faisal Karim's. I mean, Faisal Karim talks about center-periphery relation, a fight over who has control over particular areas, or particular border areas. Paul Nugent, in an article, I don't think it's in the reading list because it came out later, but I'm happy to provide the link if you're interested. An article that is very much concerned with one-stop border posts tries to think about the first stage, the agreements between countries, and highlights how lurking beneath the apparent tidiness of the package, there are manifold tensions, and tensions is one of those recurrent words that we use across this course. And he makes specific examples: South Africans perhaps contradictory or not so neatly folding into each other objectives, Tanzania's, Nigeria's, Uganda and Rwanda. So the different positions and interests of each economy, government, or domestic constituency within each of these countries, and how they play out in relation to one-stop border posts. And this is where I wanted to end this second part. He ends up by saying that, well, not surprisingly, it is at the border itself that many of these tensions play themselves in the most forceful manner. So those tensions are crucial and are the ones that I hope you developed through the previous group exercise.